Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous lecture, we talked about the rise of fundamentalism in the country and some of the conditions that made possible something like the Scopes Monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the trial itself, the action that it involved, and some of the outcomes and significance on the country in the aftermath. In the early 1920s, several states, all Southern, debated some form of law banning the teaching of evolution in the schools. Previous attempts failed until the Butler Law was considered in 1925 in Tennessee, making it a crime to, quote, teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. The campaign attracted William Jennings Bryan and Billy Sunday and other luminaries who stumped for the cause as it was being debated. One of the central issues for the debate during the Scopes trial was the matter of who should control the curriculum in schools. Should it be majority rule, or should it be at the discretion of the individual teachers? For Clarence Darrow and the Scopes defense team, the prospect of legislators dictating what could or could not be taught threatened academic freedom, itself only recently becoming an issue of public debate. This concept originated in the colleges and universities, but by the early 20th century trickled down to high schools as well. For Darrow and others, academic freedom was akin to freedom of speech or freedom of religion. However, it isn't protected in the Constitution and was therefore up to debate. According to Bryan and others, the school curriculum should rest in the hands of the parents and families, collectively represented in the legislature. Teachers are simply paid employees serving at the whim of their employers. Even H.L. Mencken supported that view and believed that academic freedom did not extend to school teachers. "The teacher is a working man, not a thinker," wrote Mencken. Both sides feared that our children, the students, would be harmed if the theories of one side or the other were forced upon them. The defense team at least advocated that both evolution and creation could be taught. The prosecution insisted that evolution could not be taught as fact, or at the expense of creationism. The matter became especially important in Tennessee, whose teachers were among the least educated in the country. Only a quarter of Tennessee's teachers had finished high school. An equal number had never attended high school at all. Thus, relying on them as a fount of academic knowledge was a perilous endeavor. Many in the state believed that they needed to be told what they could or could not teach, as they were incapable of making such decisions for themselves. In March 1925, the bill passed through Tennessee's House and Senate and was signed into law by Governor Austin Peay. So why did the law pass? Was it simply ignorant rubes at work? Perhaps. Many legislators supporting it were poorly educated and from rural counties. But representatives from urban districts voted for it as well. So this isn't the only reason. Another is political realities. Simply put, the measure was popular with most people in Tennessee, and this was a popular cause at the time. Legislators listened to their constituents. In fact, there was little visible resistance to it. Few spoke out publicly against the measure. Those who looked to the scholars at the University of Tennessee for resistance encountered none. University administrators probably feared their funding would be cut if they spoke out. So the proponents of the measure were much louder. And finally, most expected that it would be an empty letter. Governor Peay, even as he signed the act into law, said, "Nobody believes that it's going to be an active statute." Tennessee had made its point by passing the law. Few believed it would ever be prosecuted. Of course, it was, as orchestrated by the town fathers of Dayton, Tennessee. In addition to the battle between religion and science, the Scopes trial also brought to the forefront a variety of other conflicts brewing in the 1920s. One was the continuing bad blood between North and South, still not fully healed more than 50 years after the end of the Civil War. Demographic and economic factors continued to cause friction between the regions. The North was much more urban, while the South remained primarily rural. The fear and suspicion directed at the cities was therefore also primarily directed at the North. The South remained isolated and more poorly educated. Clarence Darrow, the attorney, and H.L. Mencken, the razor-tongued newspaperman who covered the trial, both made frequent and biting references to the ignorance of the typical small-town Southerner. Dayton itself became a metaphor for this small-mindedness and highlighted the North-South rivalry. Mencken wrote, "2 months ago the town was obscure and happy. Today it is a universal joke." He wrote on another instance, "The net effect of Clarence Darrow's great speech yesterday seems to be precisely the same as if he had balled it up against a rainspout in the interior of Afghanistan. That is, locally, upon the process against the infidel Scopes, upon the so-called minds of these fundamentalists of upland Tennessee." In part because of these factors, the fundamentalist movement took root much more extensively, almost exclusively, in fact, in the South. The influence of new technologies and scientific discoveries was slower to take root in the South, contributing to the appeal of fundamentalism. One northern journalist commented, "The whole region is saturated with religion. Religion takes the place of golf, bridge, music, art, literature, theaters, dancing, tennis, and clubs. It is the fundamental communal factor." Another conflict during the trial was the continuing debate about race in this country, which we could simplify as black versus white. The 1910s and 20s were a complicated time in race relations. On the one hand, the efforts of W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and other activists were bearing fruit. The Harlem Renaissance, which we'll talk about in future lectures, saw a flowering of black artistry and pride, and every large northern city experienced the movement to some extent. On the other hand, the South remained in the grip of Jim Crow. Separate but equal was the rule of the day, and society was strictly segregated. The Ku Klux Klan reached its peak in the early 20s, and lynchings occurred at a rate of 1 per week or more. Darwin's ideas, and those who commented on them in ensuing decades, did nothing to help the status of blacks in this country. Many interpreters of Darwin's theories applied the concept of evolution to the various races of humanity, arguing that the white and Nordic races were a more evolved form of human than those of African descent. This was known as scientific racism. The most extreme expression of such beliefs was the eugenics movement, which peaked in the early 20th century. Eugenicists argued that some races should be encouraged to reproduce, while others should be discouraged or prevented from reproducing. The same textbook for which Scopes was put on trial commented favorably on the practice of eugenics. Surprisingly, though, blacks themselves were divided on the issue of evolution and the Scopes trial itself. Many Southern blacks, primarily those from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, adopted a similar stance to William Jennings Bryan, supporting the Bible and creationism. Others, though, primarily from the North, realized that Darwinism might provide a key weapon in expunging racism itself. The thought that all humans evolved from a common ancestor, that we are all relatives to each other, would disarm racists of their most potent weapon. One black editor commented, "Admit that premise, and they will have to admit that there is no fundamental difference between themselves and the race they pretend to despise." A final avenue for analysis is the issue of gender. On the surface, the trial might appear to have nothing whatsoever to do with women. In fact, as the wife of one of the lead defense attorneys commented to the press, "I came all the way from New York to find that the defendant was a man, the prosecutor a man, the judge a man, the jury all men, and the attorneys on both sides men. One would think there weren't any women in this world, or that they don't do any thinking." Still, women observed the proceedings, and they did take sides. Of course, many women of the era took on the trappings of flappers and were drawn to the trial as an exciting sideshow. Throughout the episode, women posed with toy monkeys, flirtatiously circling around the all-male trial itself. However, a majority of women supported the anti-evolution side, and as much as 70% of the anti-evolution movement was female. Especially in the South, women supported the arguments of the prosecution in terms of teaching their children. They feared the prospect that learning about evolution would pull children away from the Bible and from moral pursuits. If a mother's duty is to protect her children, then Bryan and his side had the most to offer. While Darrow and the defense attorneys attempted to argue that children did not need such protection, that they could be trusted to make up their own minds when exposed to both sides of the debate, most women and mothers in this era preferred the state support in this matter. You all are reading and discussing Edward Larson's Summer for the Gods much more thoroughly, so you should understand the specifics of the trial itself, but I'll review some of the key points briefly here. First of all, recall on the side of the defense was John T. Scopes himself, the sort of unfortunate part-time teacher who happened to have the biology book in one of the days when he was teaching. And there is Clarence Darrow, the sharp-witted attorney, whose razor tongue excited the followers of the defense and those who supported that side, and angered and disappointed those who supported the prosecution, among them William Jennings Bryan, whom we've already discussed. In the view of his harshest critics, Darrow represented the Antichrist himself, as you see in this cartoon, as Darrow, the Antichrist, is looking down on agnosticism, annihilation, and spiritual despair. Both sides made compelling arguments. On the side of the defense, which, recall, is Scopes himself, the teacher, and Clarence Darrow, in essence, the arguments were pro-evolution, but they also argued on behalf of personal freedom of belief and on the sanctity of scientific authority. Darrow's defense involved mocking ridicule of fundamentalist ignorance and biblical literalism. They also argued for the rights of the minority to express their opinion. In other words, that the majority does not hold sway on matters of education. And majority rule through legislation cannot define the tenets of science or religion for individual students or teachers, and can't mandate that a subject be taught falsely. Finally, they argued that teaching evolution did not necessarily mean anti-creationism, as the law mentioned both, and as we've discussed already, one can teach evolution while also including creationism. On the prosecution side, which remember is William Jennings Bryan and Herbert and Sue Hicks and others, and their basic tenets are opposed to evolution and its teaching. They argue that the majority should control the curriculum, that the theory of evolution lacked proof, that is, those missing links along the way, and also that evolution is random and hateful, as I've discussed when discussing Bryan, and that teaching evolution undermines students' social values and faith. And finally, they argued that Scopes broke the law, which is often overlooked as we discuss this infamous trial. On that last point, the prosecution actually was right. Whatever your varying beliefs on the statute itself, Scopes had taught evolution in that classroom and thus had broken the law, and so he was, in fact, convicted at the end of the case, although that also is easily forgotten because so much of our attention focuses on Darrow and his undressing of William Jennings Bryan in the course of the trial. So let's talk about the aftermath and some of the outcomes of this trial. The fact that Bryan was indeed hugely popular and had an enormous following. The fact that the majority of the country remained rural, despite the 1920 census statistics. the fact that much of the country supported the fundamentalist cause, the fact that Scopes had lost the case. Details such as these were easily overlooked, as the popular image of Bryan as a doddering fool and Dayton as emblematic of a desperate and shrinking American backwater persisted in the literature. After the trial, the theory of evolution was removed from many textbooks. As late as the 1970s, many students arrived at college having never been taught about evolution. The fiery and powerful journalism of H.L. Mencken, the quaint but overly simplistic storytelling of Frederick Lewis Allen in his book Only Yesterday, the dismissal of fundamentalism by other prominent journalists and scholars, and the panning of Bryan as depicted in the play and later the film Inherit the Wind, drowned out the more complicated truth. Allen wrote, "Theoretically, fundamentalism had won, for the law stood. Yet really, fundamentalism had lost. Legislators might go on passing anti-evolution laws, and in the hinterland the pious might still keep their religion locked in a science-proof compartment of their minds. But civilized opinion everywhere had regarded the Dayton trial with amazement and amusement, and the slow drift away from fundamentalist certainty continued." But fundamentalism survived, much stronger than Allen and others believed. And it was not only a southern and rural phenomenon, as others have argued. Fundamentalist beliefs persist even to this day, and many of the same debates over evolution that raged in the 1920s continue to rage more than a century later.